Okay, looks great. We should now be live. Very exciting. So welcome everybody to the Radical Philosophy Hour. This is our December 2023 edition. And we are really excited today for a very interesting conversation between Bradley Kay and Carsten Stroul here around Buddhism, Marxism, and related issues. So it should be a really exciting time. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Bradley Kay. Bradley teaches in the Sociocultural and Justice Studies Department at SUNY Fredonia. His recent publications focus on philosophies of utopia and the work of Karl Marx, Kyoto School philosophy, classical Buddhism, Slavoj Žižek, and Friedrich Nietzsche. He published Marx after the Kyoto School, Utopia and the Pure Land, recently. And I should say, actually, a really important thing I want to do is plug just for a moment that it's coming out on paperback now. So please do look for that through Rowman and Littlefield. He's also published Zizek and Freedom, Utopia and the Parallax View, as well as several peer-reviewed academic articles appearing in The Agonist, a Nietzsche Circle Journal, Foucault Studies, Fast Capitalism, and International Journal of Baudrillard Studies. Today, he'll be presenting Communism and Buddhism, Living Utopias and the Eightfold Path. Carsten Stroul teaches, longtime RPAer and great supporter. Carsten Stroul teaches political philosophy and cross-cultural philosophy at the New School for Public Engagement in New York City. He taught for many years at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and at Delphi University. He's also taught at the Queen's House of Detention. He has co-edited Philosophy Now, Ethics and Perspective, The Philosophical Quest, A Cross-Cultural Reader, and When Young People Break the Law, Debating Issues on Punishment for Juveniles. He writes about Marxism, Buddhist philosophy, human nature, problems of revenge and punishment, eco-philosophy, just war theory, philosophy of nonviolence, and global ethics. He has a special interest in the intersection of Buddhism and Marxism and the possibility of a radically engaged Buddhism. His articles have appeared in a variety of journals, books, and encyclopedias. He recently contributed a chapter to the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Meditation, and he is currently writing a book entitled Interrogating Buddhist Philosophy, A Sympathetic Reconstruction. Today, he'll be presenting Marxism and Buddhism, Points of Intersection. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Carsten.
Okay, really nice to be here. And I'm really happy that we're doing this kind of panel. I have been for a while very engaged in thinking about Marxism and the way in which Marxist practice can work in the real world. And I've also been practicing various forms of Buddhist, both thinking and meditation practice. And I've been wanting to put this together, and there are a few of us who are starting to put this together. And I really do believe that in this world, we need to put these two ways of perceiving the world and acting together. So let me just say what my main point of what I'm going to talk about is I hope to demonstrate that both Marxist and Buddhist modes of understanding can both intersect and mutually enrich and support each other. And in order to make these parallels clear, I'm going to follow Buddha's Four Noble Truths in the hope of demonstrating that the patterns of Buddhist and Marxist thinking are quite similar and can work together. To start off, they both confront the problem of human suffering. That's considered in Buddhism the first noble truth. They then both proceed to analyze the fundamental causes of suffering and the impediments to overcoming suffering. That in Buddhism is considered the second noble truth. They both envision the possibility of extinguishing and overcoming suffering, which is the third noble truth. And finally, they both suggest a practice which could overcome suffering, which is the fourth noble truth. So I'm going to start with the problem of suffering, which in Buddhism is the first noble truth. And the key problem which Buddhism identifies is what is called dukkha, which is often translated suffering, but which can also be translated as a sense of unsatisfactoriness, of unease, insubstantiality, emptiness. There's no exact term that fits it. I would add maybe even a sense of disquiet. But I need to make 2 points immediately for people who are unfamiliar with Buddhism. The claim is not that existence ultimately has to be dukkha or suffering, the whole point of the third noble truth, which is the cessation of dukkha, is that it's possible to reach a level of understanding and practice which overcomes suffering. The second point I want to make as a caveat is that even when we get what we want, loss or the threat of loss remains an ever-present possibility. And simply put, everything that is will eventually cease to be. That is to say, from a Buddhist perspective, impermanence is a fundamental fact of all existence. And therefore, we will eventually lose everything, including those we love and care about. And as much as we try to avoid thinking about it, we know that we'll all end up in old age, illness, and death. Furthermore, as part of the understanding of suffering within the First Noble Truth of Buddhism, however we try to control things, we're never ultimately able to control what happens to us. And therefore, life has at its core what you might call a deep existential anxiety, a sense of inner emptiness, a feeling that there's no substantial grounding to our existence. But this does not mean that there's an ultimate kind of despair that should follow. To quote a Tibetan Buddhist, Trungpa, the bad news is that we're falling out from the airplane without a parachute, but the good news is there's no ground. So if we can just accept the falling, we're okay. The problem is the falling's pretty scary. Now to move to Marx on the same idea of suffering. For Marx, suffering takes a number of forms. The first is the suffering of immiseration, which is still the lot of perhaps the majority of people in the world who lack basic material necessities. The second source of suffering for Marx is based on the way work is organized in capitalist society. Work is most often experienced as physical and mental exhaustion, boredom, the inability to express one's creative energies. And this last entails a third form of suffering, which is that the worker is alienated from the product of her labor and from her own activity. And this leads to what Marx called alienation from our species being, that is to say, our sense of being human. And finally, there's the alienation from others because others are perceived as competitors, because we take ourselves as individuals independent of others, and because our relation with others is mediated by the commodity form. Now I want to put Buddhist and Marxist understanding together around the idea of suffering. While Buddhism emphasizes what I might call the pervasive existential and ontological nature of suffering, Marxism focuses on its social and historical nature. But it's important to say that the existential ontological suffering never exists independently of a specific social and historical context. The suffering of impermanence always manifests itself as an attempt to cling to that which is impermanent within a specific historical moment, and always takes a specific historical form. Our ultimate existential lack of control of our destiny is intensified by the organization of work within capitalist society. And conversely, the alienation and dehumanization which Marxism analyzed is the historical form of emptiness, impermanence, and insubstantiality at the core of our being, which Buddhism analyzes. Moving now to the second noble truth, the cause of suffering. For Buddhism, the proximate cause is called in Pali tanha, which is literally translated as thirst, but it's often translated as craving. This includes craving for sense pleasure, for existence, and even for non-existence. As a result of these kinds of craving, we get attached to things, to objects, to ideas, which give us pleasure, to our physical being, and in the case of people who desire suicide, to the destruction of our physical being. We also develop aversions to that which would cause us pain and which would threaten our physical being. These cravings also cause us to be attached to whatever seems to satisfy these cravings. So there's a kind of cycle of cravings that you might compare to addiction, but this is to say we're all addicted to whatever it is we crave. These cravings, however, in turn rest on a fundamental ontological illusion, and that's the illusion of a permanent and independent self, which has some kind of executive control of our intentions and actions, which is to say that for Buddhism, there really is no self. It's just an illusion, but we do have a strong sense of self, which makes that illusion seem very real. The illusion is itself generated by our attempt to avoid and confront impermanence, emptiness, and insubstantiality at the core of our being. The problem is not impermanence itself, but our inability to accept the impermanence, and therefore by the desire that there be something permanent within us. And this is a desire which cannot be fulfilled, since there is in fact nothing permanent within us. The problem is compounded by what Buddhism calls the three poisons: ignorance, greed, and ill will, each of which is also grounded in the illusion of our being a separate, independent self. Ignorance is ultimately the ignorance of the fact that there is no self. Greed is motivated by desire to do everything for me and to make everything mine. And ill will, which takes the form of hatred, anger, envy, and the desire for revenge, is based on the sense that I'm separate from others and that therefore these others are always, potentially at least, a threat to me or to that to which I'm attached. Now moving to Marx within the same issue. Suffering is caused by Marx by the division of labor in all its forms, especially by class division, but also by the division between intellectual and material labor, the gender division of labor, and even by the way in which capitalism locks individuals into different forms of labor. As the history of the human species progressed, for Marx, class division became the most significant division. And with the advent of capitalism, the ruling class, now the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, controls the forces of production and appropriates the surplus in the form of surplus value, which continues to grow relative to the total product, and the subordinate class, now the proletariat, working class, becomes at least relatively, if not absolutely, immiserated. As capitalism turns everything into a commodity, our social relations are mediated by the commodity form, which produces the illusion that commodities or money have a reality independent of human beings. Finally, what Marx called the anarchy of the market means that no one, not even the capitalist class, can control the economic fluctuations of the market. So now to put Marxism and Buddhism together around this theme. Capitalism both feeds on and reinforces the greed and possessiveness, which for Buddhism is rooted in the illusion of self. Conversely, it is precisely the illusion of our sense of a separate and independent self which provides the desperation that capitalism turns into profit, accumulation, competitiveness, and consumerism. Money in particular becomes a way to evade the ontological suffering, and at the deepest level, a way to evade the recognition that the self is empty, that it's an illusion, and therefore there is nothing within us to which we can cling. Money then is used to create a false sense of solidity, and in turn reinforces the illusion of an independent self. Thus, there is a continuous drive for more money, which is the basis of capital's continuous need to expand. But since money does not provide any genuine reality, since it can't fill the emptiness within us, it simply increases the craving and attachment which produces suffering. We must, we think, need more money, and therefore no amount of money can ever be enough. In other words, Wall Street and the need for ever-increasing capital accumulation feeds on the craving that Buddhism calls tanha. So there's a reciprocal relation between the imperatives of capitalism and the existential ontological problem which Buddhism identifies. It's the illusion of a separate and independent self which provides the fuel which capitalism transforms into profit accumulation, competitiveness, and consumerism. And in turn, capitalism reinforces this illusion. Conversely, Buddhism's analysis of the causes of suffering, as rooted in the illusion of self, needs to be supplemented by a historical account of the forms that this illusion takes in different historical periods. Capitalism, in particular, produces a certain kind of self-construction, what we might call a kind of hyper-individualism, and generates, therefore, a historically specific form of attendant suffering. Now to move to what's called the third noble truth, the overcoming of suffering, and to look at Buddhism's notion of compassion and Marx's vision of communism. While abolishing the division of labor, class exploitation, and oppression and alienation are necessary conditions for the overcoming of suffering, they're not sufficient. As long as they're the illusion of self, suffering, however socially attenuated, will still exist. Furthermore, it is unlikely that these goals can be attained without extinguishing the illusion of self. Conversely, while extinguishing the desires, cravings, and attachments generated by the illusion of self may be necessary to overcome suffering, it's not sufficient. Overcoming individual dukkha requires that we overcome social dukkha, which is to say social suffering. And this means that we must confront the economic, social, and political causes of suffering, as well as the fundamental existential ontological cause. Okay, now what's the goal of Buddhism? It's nirvana. Nirvana means literally to extinguish, as extinguishing a fire, blowing it out. It's the extinction of the craving and the flames of the three poisons, both of which are derived from the illusion of self. It's therefore also extinguishing the illusion of self. And this in turn requires a society which, instead of promoting individual separation and competition, extols interdependence and solidity. Furthermore, extinguishing the illusion of self removes the primary boundaries to the development of compassion, which for those who have attained nirvana would be impartial, universal, and boundless. But this will also require a political engagement and struggle to eliminate all social conditions which are obstacles to the cultivation of compassion. And this political engagement needs to be animated by a vision of another kind of society, a society which promotes cooperation and interdependence instead of individualism and competition. Now, as the goal of Buddhism is nirvana, the goal of Marxism is communism. As Buddhism did not say very much about the positive features of nirvana, Marx does not say very much or offers a very little of a blueprint for a communist society. But Marx did offer a vision of communism in broad strokes. Consider, for example, two main ideals of Marx's vision. The first appears in the Communist Manifesto. We shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. Thus, as capitalism fosters competition and antagonism between individuals so that one person's gain is another person's loss, a communist society would foster mutual caring, which each of us would strive to promote the capacities of others in conjunction with the development of our own capacities. Thus, communism, as Marxists envisioned it, would provide the social foundation for extinguishing the illusion of self and for the development of universal compassion. I realize I'm almost out of time, but I just want to say something about the second ideal in the critique of the Gotha program, from each according to their abilities, from each according to their needs. And of course, this sounds utopian, but Marx prefaces it with several necessary conditions, such as work time can be drastically reduced, and that work is something people do for its own sake, both because it is the way to develop their creative potentials and because it makes a contribution to the social good. And this last is especially important in thinking about Buddhism, as it entails that human beings could work without material incentives for the benefit of society as a whole. And therefore, in as communism, as Marx envisioned it, requires that human beings develop a strong sense of solidarity and caring for each other. And this requires, I would argue, some of the resources that Buddhism has for extinguishing the sense of self and its attendant sufferings. And so I want to say, I was going to say something about the Eightfold Path, but Bradley's going to say something about the Eightfold Path. So just let me say one word or two about practice, which is Buddhism actually is developing a social practice. There's a form of Buddhism called socially engaged Buddhism, which does, at least is beginning to confront the social and political and economic institutions that cause suffering, and also understands that the kind of suffering that Buddhism addresses, the existential ontological suffering, is always mediated by the social. The only problem is that that practice is not yet a radical practice. So I would say Buddhism needs to be more radically engaged, not just socially engaged. Conversely, Marxism is often organized around a certain political practice, but that practice often falls far short of what it could be because people are still motivated by the illusion of self and tied to certain kinds of attachments to ideas, which causes burnout, which causes ego trips, and ultimately often cause movements that are inspired by Marxism to fall apart. And I would add, I can't possibly argue this in a moment, that in fact, some of the problems with societies that have attempted to take a Marxist path is that they have both lacked the kind of compassion that Buddhism would cultivate, and they're still under the sway of the illusion of self. So I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Carson. That's really great and quite useful. And I'm starting to feel like there's going to be such a nice overlap here that it's going to be a really enriching conversation after the fact. So it's really positive. And just if anybody who's watching right now, you can comment on Facebook in the event, and we're monitoring that, or you can comment on YouTube there live, and we're monitoring that. So we'll be happy to respond to your questions in the conversation that follows. And with that, then I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Bradley, if you want to go ahead and take it away. And you should be able to screen share there too. Just so you know, you are muted.
Okay. Is it going? It's shared? Okay. Yeah, so Karsten, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. I agree with pretty much everything. I don't think I have much disagreement with what you said. And then the mention of the Gotha program at the end, that's where I think Marx, well, we'll talk about it more in the Q&A, but he kind of acknowledges that there's a connection to wage labor that's a little bit dysfunctional in communist thought too. But so my title of my talk is Communism and Buddhism, Living Utopias on the Eightfold Path. Let me see if I can scroll through this here. Okay, so Buddhist Marxism, Marxist Buddhism. These are different philosophies with somewhat overlapping and different views as well, but they make some tantalizing combinations. It's important to note, first off, that these are diverse discourses. Obviously, Buddhism spans centuries prior to Marxism. It's earlier in history, often overlooked as an early form of philosophy in a lot of Western philosophy departments, unfortunately, because there's a lot that can be gained. But also what's interesting is that Buddhism and Marxism sort of extend beyond their originator, right? So there are Buddhists that are not Buddha. There are Marxists that are not Karl Marx. And yet we still refer to them in terms of sort of originary figures. And there might even be subcategories within these discourses that may even contradict, like there are forms of Buddhism that may contradict other forms of Buddhism, and Marxist thought that may create aporias and sort of conflicting views within Marxism as well. So it's important to note that. So this is just one flavor, one attempt to try and overlap these two philosophies and then point out disagreements. It would be impossible to take many, many books to write a complete guide to Buddhist Marxism. So we're just sort of like dipping our toe in the water here. But so for early on, in one way to start out too is that early on in Buddhist thinking, the idea of awakening and enlightenment, there's a bit of a split early on between the Bodhisattva path and the path of the Arhats, which is little vehicle, big vehicle. Sort of the Arhat is actually closer to probably like a vanguard figure who leads the way as a shining example of awakening, and then other people follow them into awakening and enlightenment. Whereas a Bodhisattva is a bit of a humble figure who does not allow themselves to find awakening until everybody else is awakened and on the path. And so it might be comparable, just in one early way of contrasting this might be a comparable example between, say, vanguardism and Stalinism and this sort of like cult of personality, individual messianic figure leading the way. Might be similar, obviously not identical, to an Arhat figure versus like a Trotskyist or permanent revolution or universal strike, or even the line at the end of the Communist Manifesto, which often is viewed as a call to violence, but it really isn't. All that Marx and Engels say there is workers of the world unite. Might be viewed as sort of a Marxist bodhisattva call, that everybody should have this awakening about exploitation and alienation, and it should be on a global level, not confined to nationalisms like Bernie Sanders or something like that, right? But a worldwide workers unification, right? Might be more productive to sort of set aside the Arhat movement in Marxist thought and turn to a bodhisattva view of Marx. Maybe he was more of that kind of thinker without realizing it. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I had a lot about the history and possible connections between Buddhism and Marx. I'm going to skip ahead to what I said about the Four Noble Truths. It's a little bit later, and then I might circle back. So let's see. Carsten talked a little bit about this already. I mean, a lot about this already. So he covered most of it. I'll go through it very quickly. I don't want to duplicate what he said, but obviously, first noble truth, there is suffering. Suffering translates as dukkha. He already said a lot of this, so I'm going to go very quickly. But one way of looking at it is, I found a quote in German Ideology that may be a point of comparison here, and I'll get into the Eightfold Path in a second after this. But Marx says in German Ideology, it's a section about 3/4 of the way through towards the end, the philosophy of enjoyment was never anything but the clever language of certain social circles who have the privilege of enjoyment. And you see the bourgeoisie, right? People who have surplus capital, they have the ability to enjoy, right? Apart from the fact that the manner and content of their enjoyment was always determined by the whole structure of the rest of society and suffered from all of its contradictions, right? So capitalism does is create wealth inequality. The super rich have all the enjoyment sort of monopolized for themselves, and everybody's jealous on the outside watching, right? Well, that's a good point of comparison there. I think Buddha would be being that the origin story of the Buddha, when he was young, he was born into monarchy, he was a prince, he was born into wealth, he was inside the gated community, if you will. And then when he was exposed to suffering in the rest of the world, it was sort of a Marxist awakening, if you think about it, because he saw death, disease, old age, right, and poverty. And that's what awakened him to the fact that the life that he had been living was barricaded up until the point that he saw the visions of suffering, right? So there's a little bit of overlap there. And of course, Marx, in saying this line about enjoyment, is that enjoyment is really a matter of class conflict as well. Those that have more are to enjoy more, and then everybody else is sort of watching and jealous, right? And that creates a value system along the way. But the bottom line is that most suffering in the world is through vast redistribution of wealth or ending of class conflict. Vast majority of suffering would probably be either eliminated or drastically minimized in a Marxist view of that. Okay, so we already covered a lot of this. So next is second noble truth is dukkha, attachment, grasping to desire. In Carsten already mentioned this. It does translate tanha as thirst or appetite, maybe even sensual pleasure, but also appetites and desires that arise from the flesh. And so it's often, Buddha was raised in a Hindu setting. It does go back to the Hindu belief in the wheel of samsara, being attached to cycles of desire, ultimately do not bring fulfillment. It does not bring long-lasting happiness to have desires that are fleeting because the body feels enjoyment and then is unfulfilled over time, right? And so in a way, you can draw a comparison too between the way capitalism, this point that Buddha makes, and then the way that capitalism is discussed in the first volume of Capital with commodity fetishism. How are we all trained when we grow up within a capitalist economy to sort of, we have holiday shopping coming up right now, but how do kids learn to ask for toys and sort of feel jealous about what they don't have and what they wish they had? Well, it's through fetishism, right? That there's a libidinal economy in place that then structures desire in a particular way, that this object or this commodity will bring you fulfillment. As we know, as we get older, as adults, it usually doesn't. That enjoyment wears off pretty quickly, right? So that's sort of similar. Marx obviously goes into much more detail. This is just sort of a touch point here. So next, obviously, there's a cessation of desire. I'll skip through a little bit of this because it was already mentioned. Then obviously, fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which I see as sort of guiding lifelong ethics, right? Buddhism has this Eightfold Path that is, when I teach this to my students, they're surprised, but kind of, it's an aha moment because it's a different ethical set of guidelines than, say, they're familiar with the 10 Commandments, which the 10 Commandments are: don't do this, don't do that, thou shalt not, da 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 da. When I read off, and I'll do this in a second, the Eightfold Path, it's a lifelong ethics that is finding right speech, do this right. So it's almost like a positive affirmation in a way, which I don't want to go too far with that because it turns into this narcissistic, everything you think is correct kind of idea. But it's liberating in a way that it's not a negative connotation, right? You're not shamed into like, don't think this, don't think that. It's a freeing, like, find the right sense of self for yourself, right? But now we don't want to go too far with that because obviously in neoliberal capitalism, we're all told to be narcissists. Flip on any television commercial and it's, don't worry about the consequences, go for yourself, get that car you can't afford, get this house, whatever, right? And just go for it, right? We don't go too far with this sort of like cult of the self idea. The self is the greatest gift in neoliberal capitalism, but it's a lifelong moral progress going on in the Eightfold Path. It's meditating as a daily practice, cultivating the self. It takes some discipline, and Buddha called meditation, as a lot of you probably know, the sitting yoga. And so the term yoga means in Sanskrit derives from yoking, which is the one thing that you're yoked to. If you go back to the first or the second noble truth, the thing that you're yoked to is your own body. The one person you can't get away from in your entire life is yourself, unfortunately. So you might as well befriend yourself and get to know yourself and be good with that, right? So there's a liberation to that a little bit that I think is overlooked in some Marxist philosophies that look at class as this like homogeneous meta-historical idea, right? But then vice versa, in Buddhism, if you don't have that historical context, you get an atomized individual that's taken out of conditions of existence, right? And so Carson already talked a lot about this, so I don't want to overlap too much, but I kind of made a Lacanian joke in a way that neoliberal capitalism creates the finding yourself sort of cult where it's like God's mirror stage. Oh, it's me. Wow, great, wonderful. That's sort of the Buddhist thought as a corporate consultant kind of thing. And then the world is burning in the background and we don't remember material conditions at all, right? That's not the kind of Eightfold Path that I want to talk about here. So I'll get to this. Let's look at this now. So possible Marxist Eightfold Path. Let's see. So it's a very condensed, very kind of bullet points. And let's go through it one at a time. So right view, I think in a lot of Western philosophy, we have an inherited idea from, unfortunately, Roman kind of thinking on Veritas that correct view is verification between veritas, virtue between mind and thing, that it's a correspondence, and correct has to be this analytical, like seeing the object correctly. I don't think Buddhism is really like has that baggage, because there's a lot of philosophy that doesn't go through Plato to get to, what it's trying to say. So just right view in the Eightfold Path, if Mark, you try to combine it with Marxism, would be seeing a worldview, right? Not getting stuck on the narcissism or the, as Freud says, the narcissism of petty differences, which Karsten was right to mention is a problem, a dead end in a lot of Marxist thinking. But looking at a worldview transcendent to yourself, also not just trying to prop up yourself as the next vanguard figure, which is in a lot of activism. It's like, oh, everyone wants to be the vanguard individual, but thinking in a worldview, right? But also grounding restlessness of desire. That commodity fetishism likes to keep you restless. Like capitalism wants to sell you things by keeping you restless, making you feel unfulfilled, ungrounding you, making you feel anxious and worried, and keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing. So being aware of that. Then right resolve isn't just going to work and doing a job. This will be later when I talk about livelihood, but willpower against alienation, right? So in capitalism, we're kind of stuck in the sense that our labor power always, as a worker, the ends of production are not controlled by workers, right? That's the big problem. And so unless people come together as a class and seize control of that, we'll always be sort of individualist fighting in isolation, right? So willpower against alienation. Capital wants to strip the end of production from its labors, and knowing that right resolve is trying to take that back. The people who make things have control over what they're making. Right speech. Now, this is interesting because if I ask my students what does right speech mean, they get this idea of Nanny 911 or something, that TV show, be polite at the dinner table, say please, pass the salt, that kind of thing. Oh, being correct. I don't think a Marxist right speech would take that view. It's a sense of Parisian. I get this from Foucault. I know that's a little bit outside of Marx strictly defined as a Marxist, but freedom to speak, it goes back to some ideas of freedom to speak honestly for the common good, even if it's dangerous, right? Not this polite, kind of, oh, mind your manners. But I think of a figure like Greta Thunberg, not necessarily what she's saying now, but on global warming, how she gets a lot of flack for speaking up about that, and people think she's, whatever. May not be a good example depending on which topic you're talking about, but that kind of thing. Like, it's dangerous. It has to be said. You don't have to be polite about it, and someone has to kind of put these ideas out there as far as right speech, right? And so having someone who's going to fight on behalf of the working class and not have to worry about being polite, they can get their hands dirty a little bit, rhetorically speaking, right? I'm not saying Greta Thunberg's that, but okay. Okay, so right conduct, awareness of the type of labor, kindness, compassion, and also care, in the sense of going back to the problem of alienation. If people are constantly stripped of their labor, the fruits of their labor is taken away from them, how are you ever supposed to care about what you're doing in your job? Right? So if you have ownership of what you're creating, you're going to care about it. And if you're creating it for the sake of helping other people, not just for a wage, not just for profit, where the appropriation of that wealth is going to go elsewhere, you'll care about it more, because you'll know it enhances the community. It enhances not just yourself as a narcissist, but you're doing something good. Now, I've seen statistics on this, 70-80% of Americans hate their job and they're just doing it for money. That's a problem. There's not right conduct. And that brings me to the next definition here, right livelihood. This goes back to the definition of karma. And I wanted to clarify this because I think a lot of people don't know in the West the actual definition of the Sanskrit word karma, because we're inheriting a lot of Judeo-Christian kind of metaphysics. But karma goes back to the original 4 yogas. I won't get into the other 3, but karma is the yoga of work. But it's not just doing a job for wages as part of employment for yourself to get returns and make money and whatever, have a 401k at the end of your life. But your work and your livelihood extends to your entire life. what are you doing outside of work? What are you doing? It's not just 9 to 5 in the way of, like, Marx has an entire definition of this in Capital, that the working day starts to take over all of life. I think right livelihood is that it's not just jobs and employment, but how are you living your life and creating work that is then inherited by the next generation, right? So if you're on this, that whole section about reincarnation, right? Like if we're working and we're coming back in the next generation or the next reiteration, we better be careful about what we're doing now to create work that we're going to inherit later on as well, right? The karma we create now is what our next life is going to be. So what kinds of labor are you doing? Well, it may span many lifespans as well. So it's not this, you live one life. Okay, right effort, care for self, obviously awareness about burnout, exploitation, and that you may return as well. Right, mindfulness, changes are growing out of now, not in this distant futurity. So thinking of communism, there is a very good quote in the German ideology in one of my previous slides where Marx doesn't say communism is this idea out of thin air that has to be forced on people. Communism grows out of material conditions. It's any change and shift in material conditions can be a possibility for communism, right? So even meditating and a slight shift in your own in mindfulness within yourself to then detox from maybe commodity fetishism for a while. Well, it's not workers of the world unite can be like a small form of utopian communism for yourself, right? To find that space outside of the market within you. And the future will be directed from now, right? And then the last path is obviously nirvana in some versions, but samadhi. And I wanted to focus a little bit on that for a second because it's a meditative absorption or union. In some versions of the Eightfold Path, the culminating awareness is awareness of conditioned co-production, which is that every cause is caused by more than one thing. So nirvana gives us one view of this, that cessation of desire, right? Tempering down maybe some of the ways that capitalism can sensationalize and get us all excited about buying things and all that. But there's another aspect of it too, that it brings us a greater worldview that we are interconnected, whether we like it or not. We are always conditioned to co-productions. Pratitya Samutpada is in a lot of Hindu, but not it's in some aspects of Buddhism as well. And so, for example, the awareness, like over the summer, I'm in Buffalo, just to use a common example. Over the summer, we had the fires in Quebec that were seeping in and we were getting all the smoke. That would be an awareness that it's not just, we're all interconnected, whether we like it or not, right? What happens in Quebec has an effect on us. And what happened in Quebec was a result of warming in other areas of the world and use of carbon that wasn't necessarily particular to Quebec, right? So like a Marxist view of that would be private property and alienation and all these tactics keep us divided. But the reality is, whether we like it or not, we're always already in the world together. We can't like avoid that. So how am I doing on time? Sorry. A couple more.
Sorry, yeah, you're down to probably a minute. We might go ahead and close it so we have some time to talk, and maybe that we can come back to those if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, thanks so much, Bradley. That was really exciting and enlightening. And that's funny that I used that word. Anyhow, I have a lot of thoughts and questions. And I would tell you we have viewers on YouTube for sure. So we're going to go ahead and turn to their questions if anybody has any. I'm not see I see one question from Douglas, but it's about asking questions. So that has yet to turn into a question, but hopefully it will soon. And I don't know, Jake, is there anything on Facebook yet?
No, not seeing anything there either at the moment, but remains to be seen.
Well, then, Jake, if you would like, do you want to lead us off with the first question?
Sure. Actually, there was, I think, two things briefly mentioned, but I think I really appreciate, the attempt to sort of start thinking of it, especially this, social historical complementing the existential. But my thought is two things sprung to mind immediately. You mentioned the bodhisattva, right? And the bodhisattva vow, at least in Mahayana Buddhism, right? That points towards this communal, desire for everyone to overcome, which I see a commonality in, as well as if we're thinking utopically or communally, something like the Sangha, for example, as a resource, right? A communal resource, because if the difficult part, of course, is, one is a religious philosophical and the other is more explicitly economic philosophical. And I'd say that, like, if we're thinking of this in terms of, practical action, which it sounds like we are, then I would think of the Sangha especially and communal resources, right? Those sorts of traditions, because those sorts of traditions have always had seeds of utopia. So I wonder if both of you could speak to that.
Please go ahead, Carson.
So just one thought that comes to me. I assume people know about Thich Nhat Hanh, who is one of the major figures in engaged Buddhism. And one of the things that I find quite fascinating is he's quoted as saying, the next Buddha is going to be the Sangha. In other words, it's not going to be the individual, it's the community. And since I've been working with groups that are engaged Buddhist groups, what I notice is engaged Buddhist groups try as much as possible not to have a leader or a guru, but try to collectively come up with how they're going to proceed and their practice, both in terms of their meditative practice and in terms of their practice in the world. And so I think Sangha can have a much larger meaning. It's not just the Sangha in the monastery. It's the Sangha of people who want to take this path. And part of this path can be the socially engaged path. But it's not the it's not the vanguard party.
Can I jump in? I think too, I had other examples that I was mentioning as well, but I think of, say, for example, the Zapatistas, where they're trying to mask, sub-commander Marcos puts the mask over and he's sub-commander, he's not a vanguard, like those kind of things. There's definitely some possibility with those kind of tactics as well. And I think obviously the problem is that, when you're mirroring capitalist structures of power, you already have some trace of that ends up in the consciousness of the group somehow. Like, I've tried to really write a lot about groups that try to establish like a group dynamic and then dissolve when it becomes too nefarious, like they start galvanizing around a particular leader. Like, the last thing you would want in this day and age is like a worldwide situation where it's a cult of personality like they have in North Korea or something like that, which is, that's a problem. But the problem is that communism kind of carries that signifier, even though it really isn't. Everyone who reads Marx knows that's not what communism is, but everyone who only knows about it from the outside thinks, oh, that's what it's going to end up being, right? So the problem, I think, is when you set up a Sangha, you have to do it within the context of a non-messianic metaphysics. Like, it can't be this one person will lead us to the promised land kind of thing, which is, it's the basis of a lot of Judeo-Christian and Islamic, perhaps some aspects of it, metaphysics. But when you go into Brahmanist and Eastern thought, there's a conditioned co-production is kind of the metaphysics in the background of it. The problem is, how do you unlearn like hundreds of years of this other, messianic stuff? But it's a good question. Like, it'll take a long time to kind of meditate and unpack a lot of that.
Yeah, Carson.
I just want to pick up on Bradley's comment a little bit. The cult of the leader, which has been so much part of socialist and communist movements, for me, exemplifies the problem of the illusion of self. And it exemplifies why, unless you get rid of that illusion, you're going to totally distort socialist movements, because they're going to slip so easily into the cult of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important and imperative point. I wanted to follow up. Let me make sure I'm not skipping any questions online. Okay, I'm not on YouTube at the least. So I wanted to follow up with a question about one of the things that has always struck me as a kind of dissimilarity between the two, and I'm wondering how you all might address this individually. and you'll have to pardon this way of framing it, but it is our world. So you might think of Buddhism as kind of the consumption side, right? I mean, because it's really oriented toward a relationship to the object as object of desire, as object of craving, as object of attachment. Whereas it strikes me that, obviously Marxism is about the creative production of things in a world and potentially of a world on the whole. And so I guess, as I look at those two things, that there's a kind of dissimilarity. And of course, when you think about the question of alienation and separation from the product, and then ultimately separation from your nature, for Marx, those two things are tightly interwoven. That is to say, your creative productive capacity is, I think, really closely aligned with what it is to be a human being in that Marxist framework. And so I was just wondering, your thoughts about that issue and how we might seek out alignment between them if you did frame it the way I did, or if you think that framing is just really misguided. So I'll stop there. And maybe if you want to continue, Carson, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that the Buddhist understanding of the consumption side is the critique of consumption. That is, what's the problem? The problem is we crave. The problem is we get attached. And then, of course, capitalism uses that craving and attachment to attach ourselves to commodity forms, both in terms of money and to particular things. And one way of thinking of it that I didn't mention is advertising plays on precisely that kind of craving. That's the whole point of advertising. So the Marxist critique of craving and attachment is a critique of the whole way our consumer advertising industry works.
I would add to this too, that the view of, I mean, it's a question of why is Buddhism so amenable to sort of corporate team building retreats and go back to work and work harder after you've de-stressed and all this kind of stuff, right? Well, I mean, I think if you take a Marxist view of the Four Noble Truths, dukkha is, for Buddha, dukkha is reality. There is no escape. They might be minimized, but it's always going to be there. Like, so get used to it, right? It's like the pebble in your shoe, and there's a little bit of suffering that is reality. It's never completely gone. So to get that idea of a utopia where everything is perfect, I think is a bit of a naive, like I'm trying to combine the two to say that there is some aspect of suffering that is just in reality, since we have a body and it has desires and appetites. But the idea that suffering, so the wrong way to think of the Four Noble Truths, I think, is the way that I think capitalists do promulgate it, which is all suffering can be removed, and then we're just docile bodies consuming, and we're docile, useful bodies just walking around happy all the time, man. Going through the supermarket and getting whatever we want, right? And go on Amazon and buy whatever you want, right? That's like the wrong way of thinking about the first noble truth and second noble truth and detaching and meditating and like the cult of me, which capitalism just immediately takes and turns into something that reproduces consumerism. I think if you take the Marxist view, it's that suffering is still always going to be there. We can minimize it through redistribution of wealth, shifting wage labor. I was even going to make a point about wage labor is part of the problem, taking a radical view on that. But the idea that suffering can be turned into a useful sort of tactic for resistance, that it's not just get rid of suffering and turn into a narcissist and like a utopia of yourself, but it can be turned into a tactic of like, well, suffering is real, let's get used to it. And now, instead of trying to soften that through this like narcosis of self-love and people cult of how do I say, like I mean, I should say, because there's so much more I can say. I mean, Antonio Negri goes into this a lot in most of his work.
So we have
but go ahead.
And I just, Bradley, I want to pick up on one of the things you said, that Buddhism becomes a form of commodity, but that's not Buddhism. It's the commodification of Buddhism. And the commodification of Buddhism undercuts the whole idea of right livelihood. because, I mean, look, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who actually has done some really great work, both socially and in terms of bringing mindfulness, has palled around with the corporate head of the auto industry, and brings many mindfulness forms are brought into corporate settings. But that's because Buddhism gets commodified. And that's the problem with any kind of potentially subversive challenge to capitalism. Capitalism finds wonderful ways to turn whatever challenges it gets into another form of commodity.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. If that's okay. I just want to kind of put them out there. The first thing that has come in on YouTube is just a recommendation. It says that the person is wondering whether you've read Gail Umvet's Buddhism in India. And they say that Gene says here that it addresses both Marxian and Buddhist outlooks within the practical reality of the Indian caste and class relations. That's a comment. And then here's Naomi. She writes, do you find a critique of the nuclear family in Marxism and Buddhism? And in parentheses, it says attachment/ownership as expressions of love. So maybe the Buddhism and the family, Buddhism, Marxism and the family could be something you might want to address here.
Yes, there's actually, so I've taught sociology of family for a few years now, and there's actually a really good book by anthropologist Kai Hui. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Society with No Fathers and No Husbands is the title of it, and it's a sort of anthropological view of this group that has matrilineal relations, sort of passing on wealth, obviously through the mother side of the family, and they're not in binary monogamous relationships. It's sort of women choose whatever, open, and the whole village raises the child because it could be anybody, right, who's partnering up to conceive. And you get about halfway through this book and you realize they're all Maoists. They're all Mao. They like loved Mao when it was in the modern times. Like, this is a village that's kept this tradition of like, it takes a village to raise a child kind of thing, all the way up from like thousands of years ago to modern times. It's probably disintegrating now, but and maybe a tourist trap now, but that's just fascinating that that's kind of factored in, that they would have a communist ideology that they latch onto in the aftermath, right? So Mao is after they've already learned these communal styles of family relations, and they're like, oh yeah, I recognize that. That's interesting. Communism, it's a good idea, right? But anyway, so that's a really good book to look into as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say that Buddhism in particular is very ambivalent in terms of the family. On the one hand, if you go to classical Buddhism, people leave their families and they join the monastery. Of course, it also means that they're celibate, but they're detached from their family in some sense. On the other hand, in even classical Buddhism, there is a room for householders, people who don't want to join the monastery, and they are people who traditionally have families. And in classical Buddhism, right action includes not doing sexual harm, and implicitly often includes some form of monogamy. So I'm not sure you can read out any specific thing. I think the main thing is the idea of non-attachment. You can't, if you're attached to the family in a way that precludes your having a more universal, impartial compassion, that becomes a problem. And that's in Buddhism. Marxism also, I think, is ambivalent. Engels thought that ultimately people would form monogamous pairs. It doesn't say family, but so I don't know that, that this is a more modern discussion than either Marxism or Buddhism can encompass.
Well, Engel's book on the family is really interesting. There's a lot of historical inaccuracies, but it is an interesting book that on different family organizing and principle of property ownership is
Mhm.
he
Yeah.
reduces it to the nuclear family is perfect for private property relations. But there's some interesting stuff too. And I would mention just in Buddha, his life story, one of his most important disciples was his son Rahula.
Mhm.
Rahula was born. I mean, we don't really know because there's a historical Buddha and then there's all the stories about the Buddha that are later probably written and created. But it was alleged that Rahula was born the day that uh, Buddha had his awakening under the Bodhi tree. So his family's like really important. But Rahula translates, I always tell this to my classes and they laugh, but Rahula translates from Sanskrit as little demon or little anchor. Family keeps you grounded, but also weighs you down. So it's kind of a double-edged kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's like ambiguous. Like you love your family, you care about your family, but it's also like a bond that is there for life now, right? So he's stuck in a way. And Rahula ended up becoming one of his most important disciples and carrying on his teachings after he died, right? But it's interesting. There's a lot in that.
So I'm awaiting. I have one who's asking to send a question in through through Google, Gmail, and I do want to say we're just about out of time, so I don't want to hold anybody here too much longer. I really have appreciated this, and I think the questions that we received were really excellent. And I don't know if you all are feeling this. I feel it every time, and I know Jake, you probably feel it this way too. Like I have like a bunch of questions, and I'd happily extend this to be a 2-hour session. And I'm sure we could continue, but unfortunately, that probably won't work. And I feel bad because I know the Rich made an extra special effort to watch today, and I'd hope to be able to get his question in, but it looks like we're not going to get it. So Carson, if you want to close this out, and Bradley with some final thoughts, I'd be happy, and we can head on from there.
I want to pick up on something Bradley was talking about, right speech, and you used, Marxism as one way to understand right speech. There's a lot of radical stuff in Buddhism and right speech. I mean, Buddhism would be a critique from even classical Buddhism is a critique of advertising. And so much of political speech is not telling the truth or obfuscating the truth. And so much of political discourse is inflaming passions rather than trying to get at the core of the problem. I mean, all this is right speech in even the traditional Buddhist sense. It's a real critique of the speech that is used throughout the society, without just with Buddhism alone.
So, and sorry, Brad, I'm shouldn't cut you off. Go ahead.
No, oh, well, that's exactly right. I mean, there were a lot of other examples I had in my previous slides that I skipped through due to time, but the idea that, if you go into even the koans, the early koans in Buddhism, they're not this polite, mind your manners kind of stuff. Like there's stuff that is just shocking, it throws you off, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. And that's the moment of enlightenment, is the cut or the sting of like, wait a minute, that was unexpected. And that gives you an awakening, right? It doesn't have to be a comfortable truth where everyone is in a safe space. Perhaps I don't want to use that term because it is important, obviously, to have safe spaces and that, but there is an uncomfortability with truth sometimes that is important to an awakening. I think is early koans kind of show that. So sorry.
I can just say one more thing about Buddhism and Marxism that is occurring to me. They're both fundamentally radical in the way we ordinarily think about things. I mean, we think of the society as it's a given. And one of the most radical things Marx can say, independently of the critique of capitalism, which is quite radical, is the society is not just a given. It's a historically developed process. And Buddhism has a very radical idea. We think of the sense of self as a given, something that's already in us. We're all independent people. And what Buddhism says is that's wrong. The sense of self is an illusion. But it is a very powerful illusion, just as the idea that our society is a given is a very powerful illusion.
Well, that's the Kensho moment of awakening. The true awakening in Kensho is that you awaken to a non-essentialist or an anti-essentialist awareness of the self. That it's
Both
not
are fundamentally
real. You're a
essential.
blank slate. And so you go back to early Buddhism, and it's the Heart Sutra is a very important sutra for this as well. Form is void, void is form, and the 5 skandhas are empty. What fills it up, if you don't know the practice of how to empty it, is commodity fetishism, advertising. Like, if you don't take control of your third eye and take control of your consciousness, guess what? Some corporation probably will through advertising, right? So it's important to kind of detach and detox from that. So, sorry.
Yeah, that's all great. Very exciting stuff. I will say from my end, I would love to pick both of your minds about sort of more, let's say, mystical and metaphysical ontological sides, specifically as it relates to questions of illusion and impermanence and interdependent arising or co-arising, or you said co-production, the various ways that it's translated. And I think all of that is reflected in what you're saying, and would certainly warrant further reflection on this potential similarity between the two. So, really, really great stuff. Well, unfortunately, I never got that question in, and I know we probably need to be off here now. I want to thank you both so much for coming. I know Jake and I were really looking forward to this, so it was really fascinating talk. And I think we've both learned a lot. And yeah, please do. This will be up on YouTube if you're watching right now. Comment. 2 of them can engage you on YouTube. You can reach out to them individually and engage them there. Or I'm sure in the future you can send me questions and I can send it to them. So a lot of ways to continue the engagement. I hope it continues from here. And thanks so much, guys.
Yeah. And Brandon and Jake, thank you so much for organizing this.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for putting this together.